connecting. So we'll give folks a few minutes while you're connecting. Certainly appreciate everyone who's taken the time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening. And we'll get started shortly because I know some people are still connecting to the live stream. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that I'm addressing you from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I also just want to express the Ontario Greens' steadfast commitment to the truth and reconciliation process as we work to dismantle colonialism and systemic racism, and just express my gratitude for how much I've learned from Indigenous peoples about how to care for the land and water, the plants, the animals, and the people who live here. And I want to just say how much I appreciate everyone who's joining us tonight for this really important conversation. And I especially want to say how much I appreciate Sonia Furstenau, a good friend of mine and the leader of the British Columbia Green Party, for joining me tonight. I first got to know Sonia really in 2017 when she was elected as the MLA member for Quitchman Valley and has been the leader of the BC Green Parties since September of 2020. And Sonia is, like most Greens, very focused and hardworking, making sure she serves her constituents. She's done a lot of work on watersheds, child wellness, infrastructure and health and education, and supporting First Nations leadership. Prior to her election to the legislature, Sonia served as a director for the Cowichan Valley Regional District for 3 years. And she also worked as a teacher in the Victoria School District and in Shawinigan. I had the opportunity of knocking on doors and attending many events with Sonia in 2017. And I just really appreciate how well you engage with people, how much you clearly care for your community, and how much fun it was to just get to know you and your constituents the few days I spent with you. And I think one thing that the two of us really share is that we both worked a lot on protecting water for our community prior to being elected, and I think played a really important role in both your election and my election. So I want to just thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm on the territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Cowichan tribes and Malahat nations. And I think now more than ever, recognizing the relationship to the people who have historically tended to the lands that we are on is more important than it's ever been. And as with you, we are committed to reconciliation and to the movement to a post-colonial reality for British Columbia and for Canada. It's interesting. A couple things, Mike. You are still the most impressive door knocker I have ever known in my life. For everybody watching, Mike can knock on more doors than any other person I've ever met, and it was such a pleasure to get to know you. And I was so delighted when you won your seat in Ontario, and I know that your constituents and Ontario is so well served by you. I was just in my old classroom at a school I used to teach at here in Shawinigan. I was talking to a grade 4 or 5 class. And of course, 9, 10-year-olds, they weren't here when we were in our formidable efforts to protect our watershed from a contaminated landfill. So I gave a brief story about that. And one of the students said, so technically you're the leader of the BC Green Party because some people wanted to dump contaminated soil in our watershed. I said, technically, you've summed it up. There's the last 8 years of my life all in one. But like you, Mike, I remain committed to recognizing that we depend on our natural systems. We depend on clean water and clean air and soil. And that is being reinforced in ways in British Columbia this year, unlike any other time in my life. And it is a very significant wake-up call to the seriousness of climate change and the impacts that we're seeing.
Yeah, I was going to say, this has just been such an extraordinary year. I mean, obviously, the last 20 months with the pandemic and everything we've all been through. But I see the cascading just climate disasters that have been hitting British Columbia in particular, with the heat dome this summer, the forest fires, now the flooding and mudslides. And I just think for those of folks tuning in from Ontario, maybe if you could, I mean, most of us, I think, have probably seen the pretty horrific pictures and videos. But if you could maybe just give a little firsthand account of what it's like to be in British Columbia right now.
You know, I'm going to walk through a bit of the year, because I think it is cumulative. And you know, I was just listening to the radio on the way back home, and the announcer saying, you know, just a week ago, I had been starting to think that maybe I'll do some traveling, you know, go to the Kootenays or go to the Rockies over Christmas. And now those plans are gone because our highways are not accessible. Several of them are damaged to such an extent that it'll be months before they're usable again. But I think here in BC, it has been a succession of climate-related impacts that we've seen that have really, you know, for those of us who have been saying climate change is an emergency and this is real, it's hard to even capture how significant. So the heat dome at the end of June and beginning of July, I've never experienced 44 degrees temperature in my life, but that's what it was on our front porch in the shade over that weekend. And stepping outside into heat like that, you immediately know that you're in an emergency situation, because it alters you. You can't think straight. And what we didn't have at the time, and I think, you know, hopefully we've learned, is the widespread education about, you have to understand that this heat is not like heat you've ever experienced before. This is deadly. And we lost close to 600 people from that heat wave. Those are deaths that are related to climate change. And what that heat dome really highlighted was not only that, you know, the impacts on climate change are going to be so significant, but they are going to very much impact people who have the least resources to protect themselves. So people who didn't have air conditioning or heat pumps, who didn't have shade to be able to get away from that heat, who live in apartments in urban areas. This is where those deaths happened. And that's a very clear line between climate change and inequality. And when we talk about action on climate change and climate justice, that heat dome reinforced how serious that is. The wildfires, of course, hit rural communities, Indigenous communities the hardest. People had to be evacuated for extended periods of time, sometimes evacuated over and over again. And we come out of that wildfire season and we have a little bit of respite, and then we get these atmospheric rivers. And I remember ahead of the first one, which was just over 2 weeks ago, reading the weather conditions, and it said a fire hose of water. And I said to my husband, like, what kind of weather prediction is a fire hose of water? Like, I've never heard anything like that before. And that first atmospheric river certainly was a fire hose. And now we're in the third one right now. The flooding continues. The recuperation from the first two rivers hasn't even begun. And infrastructure has been destroyed. Lives have been lost. People have lost homes. The farmers in Abbotsford have lost their livelihoods. I don't think we can even begin to calculate how significant the damage has been from the flooding that we've seen here. And these are now not only a continuum of climate change impacts, but they are interconnected. And so the forest fires undermine the soil's ability to absorb water. They become hydrophobic. And then we have these significant rain events. And so the soil is not able to even absorb the water that it would typically be able to absorb. The reality around infrastructure and culverts, I've heard a lot about culverts in the last couple of weeks, that our culverts are in our highway infrastructure aren't built to withstand the volume of water that we're seeing right now. And I think that, this moment we're in, of course, where the state of emergency continues, the really devastating stories that we're hearing, particularly from the Lower Mainland, and the recognition that we weren't prepared. And those are all things that we need to now look into the future with and say, we really do, when we say you have to look at decision making through a climate change lens, this is what the 2021 in British Columbia has reinforced in no uncertain terms. All of our decision making has to be through a climate lens.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Sometimes people say, what difference can one MPP make? And there are lots of little differences you make. And one of them I did was I asked the financial accountability officer here in Ontario to actually do a study of what our infrastructure, what's at risk, and what the cost of making it climate resilient is. And at the time I first requested that, and they've almost completed it, and they'll be making a final report on it soon. I thought I really wanted to use the numbers to talk about mitigating climate and crushing climate pollution and the need. But now I've recognized that not only is it making that argument, but it's also like just being honest with people about what it's going to cost to even make our infrastructure like able to withstand these climate shocks. And I'm just curious, when you say, British Columbia wasn't prepared, maybe if you could just elaborate a bit more on, the lack of preparedness, what that's meant for people, what it's going to mean in terms of just, recovering from this. And
it's a great question, Mike. And when you talk about the report that you've asked to be done, I think this is one of the challenges that we have, is that there are no shortage of reports from the last several decades, really, that indicate the impacts that we're going to see from climate change. And whether those are IPCC reports, the Code Red report we saw last year, or they are reports like from 2014 on atmospheric rivers and their impact in British Columbia that was presented to the Ministry of Environment 7 years ago. The reports and the understanding from scientists about what the accelerating and intensifying impacts of climate change are going to be exist. What we have been lacking, and this is not just British Columbia. I mean, we just came through the COP26. We are lacking the political will to, as you say, be totally truthful about the implications of where we're at climate-wise, and what both the cost of appropriate action in mitigation and adaptation are going to be, and they're significant, but also the cost of inaction. And we are now seeing in British Columbia the cost of inaction, and the fact that we had the information from 2014 saying, we went through the list, it identified every single impact that we have seen from these atmospheric rivers, and the steps that should have been taken to be prepared for these. But this is where our human nature, and I think about this a lot, we react really well in emergencies. Typically, as humans, we take care of each other, we go into emergency mode. We have this amazing system that produces adrenaline and puts us into a state where we can perform almost superhuman feats. And we're seeing that in BC right now. People are extraordinary in emergencies. What we're not particularly good at as humans, and I will count myself among this, is preparing for things that are in the future, being aware of, I need to take these steps, but it's a sunny day right now, and this is the part that we have to overcome as leaders and politicians, this is what leadership actually requires of us, is to say, I recognize that this can seem hard to understand why we would be taking all of these very significant steps, spending all of this money right now, but that's our job. We've read these reports, we've had this input, we understand what's, we've been informed by scientists, and our job is to look to the future and to shape that future in a way that makes it more resilient, more secure, and ideally brings back the kind of predictability and certainty to some level that we've lost in a lot of ways in this last year, and compounded, and you and I were talking about this just before we came on, but compounded by a global pandemic, which has itself robbed us of predictability and certainty. These are times that require us to be willing to, again, tell the truth, and be open and honest about the kinds of decisions that need to be made and what's informing those decisions. What is the evidence? What is the data? What are the reports that are informing these decisions? Why are we taking them? How are we going to measure their success? And that's the kind of governance that I think we need to see more of in all of our provinces and in this country.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that, Sonia. I mean, we released the Ontario Greens, we released our climate environment plan a few weeks ago, right before COP, and most of the political commentary was the Greens have bet big on climate, and do they really want to get elected? and I just kept telling my team as we were stressed about that a bit, that we have to be honest with Ontarians, and I would say that, we have to be honest with everyone in the world, the country, every province, of the scale of the challenge and what it's going to take to address it, both from a mitigation and adaptation perspective. And I'm on that note, I was wondering if I could just talk politics with you a little bit. It wasn't that long ago that British Columbia had a minority government, and the BC Greens held the balance of responsibility. I've always loved that phrase that you used. And the Clean BC plan was introduced, and I think many of us across the country were like, whoa, that's what a minority government can produce. That's what 3 Green MLAs, that's the difference they can make. And then we now subsequently see a majority government, NDP government in British Columbia, and we've seen things like old growth logging, significant investment and ramp up of liquefied natural gas. And so I'm just curious, that shift from a minority to a majority government, what it's meant for climate planning, climate action, environmental issues, protections in general.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have a lot to say about this. I reflect on this a lot, Mike. And I think I'll start federally. I mean, the fact that we just came through a federal election that was essentially unnecessary, and that the voters delivered the exact same composition of a minority government federally, and basically said to all of the elected and political leaders, we expect you to work together. And that's what minority governments require of us, is you have to work together. And we've just come through the first full year of this majority government, and one of the things we've done is compare it to the first full year of the minority government. And back in 2018, that first year, we had 57 pieces of legislation go through the House. This year, we had 30. So almost half as much legislation. The legislation in 2018 was, electoral financing reform. It was an enabling legislation for a referendum on proportional representation. We'll talk about that later, but it was environmental assessment reform that incorporated much better approaches around Indigenous consultation, community consultation. It was professional reliance reform, which was, of course, very central to me. And a big reason why I ran. So moving, ensuring that government oversight of decision-making when it comes to regulation and oversight of land use in our province wasn't just in the hands of industry hired qualified professionals, that there's a very important role for government to be playing in protecting the public interest when these decisions are being made. We had a very robust, there was a legislation about housing, and overall a much less conflict-oriented legislature. And what we've seen in this year, this first year of the majority government, is some pretty controversial pieces of legislation. The most controversial being the Freedom of Information, the changes to the Freedom of Information Act, which put a fee applied the day the legislation passed, a $10 fee on Freedom of Information requests in BC, as well as some other pretty significant changes. Much of it with a lot of opposition widely. We've seen some changes to Forestry Act and Forest Range and Practices Act, but we didn't actually get to fully debate those bills because the government called closure or time allocation on those bills. And so I'm lamenting in a lot of ways what we had, which was a lot more collaboration, and that was across all three parties, especially in 2020 in response to the pandemic in the early months. A lot more collaboration, a lot less conflict, and a lot more consensus building on where we were ending up with legislation. And what we've seen this year is 57 government caucus seats being able to move any legislation through, limited debate, both from government and opposition side because of either government not speaking to it or, opposition not having the opportunity. And this is not healthy for democracy. And I think that all of us in elected positions need to be very mindful of the fragility of democracy, of the need to build trust. And that trust is built through transparency, accountability, openness. And we've seen a shift away from that under this majority government. So I'll say this to people of Ontario: give yourself the best kind of governance that you can have, which is governance that requires collaboration and cooperation. And that is in minority government. And you are very best served with Greens in those positions of the burden of responsibility. And it is a burden. It is significant, and it is not about power. It is about sharing that very serious burden. And we can look to places like New Zealand, where Greens have played, and now Germany, playing very significant roles in these coalition types of governments that recognize that decision-making is at its very best when it's informed by more than one perspective. And, that's what we should be striving for in our legislatures and in our parliament.
I'm glad to know that your dog likes to join your Zoom calls. Mine does as well. He's made a few appearances in these events, as well as he's joined me in some committee hearings as well. So on that note, it's interesting you were talking about the environmental assessment process, because I literally was debating that in the legislature earlier today, and really tried to make a nonpartisan appeal of just saying, hey, this isn't a partisan issue. This is just like, look what's happening in British Columbia right now. Land use planning matters, public engagement on infrastructure projects matter, and to sort of exempt those from environmental assessments sets us up for the kinds of, potentially catastrophic type situations that you're experiencing in BC now. And I wish we were in a political system that allowed for more collaboration and conversation across party lines to be able to address some of these issues that, I think affect people's health, their well-being, like the cost of infrastructure. I mean, I could see how you could view this from a conservative, liberal, NDP, green lens, like all party lenses could have input in putting together a system that is fiscally, environmentally, socially responsible. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate that you had that in British Columbia and lost it, and what a significant change it was.
Mm-hmm. And I really learned, I came from local government as well. I spent 3 years at the regional district, and of course, we don't have parties at the local government here in BC, although in Vancouver there are parties. But and so every decision that we were making at that table, we were all getting the same information, the same inputs. We were all listening to each other as we asked questions of either staff or experts who were providing us with that information. And then we would discuss it around the table. That's how local governments typically work. And it's not like you always voted the same way as, three other people. You voted on a case by case basis to try to achieve the best outcome for your community. And I think that this is one of the things that I think I saw in and experienced in the minority government quite a bit more than the opportunities we have in the majority. But committee work is an example of this, and committees, all party committees that hear from the same experts, read the same documents, debate and discuss, and come up with typically consensus-based recommendations for the legislature. That's where the potential for really good legislative work exists. And unfortunately, what we see in majority governments far too often is, and we just saw it here with the Freedom of Information Act, is a kind of dismissal of that work of the committee, and government just does the opposite, or does things that weren't recommended at all by the committee. And again, that undermines what the potential of democracy is. All of these representatives coming from different regions, representing different points of view. But the fantastic thing is when you actually put everybody at the table and you work together, you can get to the best place of the combination of all those views. And I don't know why we are so reluctant to recognize that in every other sector, we champion collaborative work, right? We recognize that that's how we get to our best place. We should have that same expectation of our politics and our governance.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Sonia, I just wanted to, we've had some questions come in from our audience, and I'm just going to read a few of them off. And so the first one is, what is it going to take for accountability when scientists who've been for decades warning us of what was to come, politicians, CEOs, and fossil fuel interests purposely misguiding the public for their own benefit? What's it going to take to get accountability?
Oh boy.
I know it's a big question. That's what I thought. But I thought, you know what, I want to honor the folks who are listening.
It's a great question. It's an unbelievably important question right now, because the risk that we have is that ultimately elections are supposed to be about accountability. So you have the opportunity in an election to say, either this party lived up to its promises or they didn't, and I'm going to choose differently. Unfortunately, we have things undermining that. We have lower and lower voter turnout. And there's been some increases in the past few years, but in BC, for example, last year we had a 50% voter turnout. And that's very worrying. So when people become cynical and feel like, well, they're all the same, they get in there, they don't do what they said they were going to do, and I don't believe any of them anymore. The problem with that is that erodes the democracy piece of things. And, at its core, it is the citizens in a democracy that hold governments to account. But governments and elected people have a very significant role to play in that. Being transparent, being open and honest about decision-making processes, not hiding what is public information from the public, being, releasing data, releasing information and evidence. All of those things help with accountability, because you can actually measure, are they doing what they said they would do? I think, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of kind of governance by communication. And instead of getting really straightforward information, we're getting a lot of spin, a lot of carefully crafted statements and sidestepping of questions. This is why media is so important, and why they play an integral role in democracy, and independent media holding government to account, asking those hard questions, reporting on what is happening is essential for the public to be able to understand what government's doing. But I have one thought on accountability and voter turnout, which is, and I came up with this a couple of weeks ago, it's a buddy system. So next time you go to vote, and Mike, when's the election in Ontario?
June 2nd of next year. So we're gearing
June
up.
2nd of 2022. So that's in just over 6-7 months from now. Bring a buddy up. So, and especially if you can find someone who didn't vote last time. And it's not to say you're telling them how to vote, but let's all share that accountability for the one piece of a democratic system when people hold a lot of power, which is on election day. Let's get that voter turnout up. Let's make a commitment that in our communities, in our families, our neighborhoods, we are going to buddy up and increase the voter turnout and show the politicians, us, that we are to be accountable. And that's one small thing that we can all do.
Yeah, well said. I appreciate that. I have another question for you. This one, young people seem to get it regarding climate change. Seniors, not so much. How do we bring the two together to form what I believe would be a formidable change agent?
That's a great point. There are, and I'm not kidding, there are organized efforts here to get grandchildren to talk to their grandparents about climate change. And what we've seen, and I think it's really been a shift, particularly around protecting old growth, is elders for old growth. They all wear signs when they come out, and often they're accompanied by their grandchildren. And I think that those conversations between generations, these are the two generations in a way that really do need to connect and understand that as a grandparent, I can't wait to be one. I hope I get that joy and pleasure at some point. We just had our niece had triplets a couple of weeks ago. That was very exciting. So as a grand aunt, I'll say, I think that we are all inclined to think, what do we owe to our grandchildren? We want to bequeath to them the best possible outcomes. And that right now, what we need to be thinking about bequeathing our grandchildren is a stable climate and a secure and stable, resilient world for them to live in. And we hear a lot about 7 generations, and I think that we've had a long time in politics post-war, and I studied and taught history, and I think I like to think about the kind of longer trends and threads here. But post-war, of course, we had this era, especially in Western societies, of abundance and the ability that you can achieve anything you want, and this kind of story of our society being very individualistic, but you just work hard and you can have anything you want. And I think we have to change that story. And that story, it's almost, instead of the grandparents telling the story to the grandchildren need to tell that story to the grandparents about the world that they want to bequeath to their grandchildren. What does this look like 2 or 3 generations down the road? Can we still operate in this place of, accumulation and overuse of resources and growing inequality? And I think we all know at our core, these are destabilizing, and we don't want our children and grandchildren to have to endure those destabilized worlds that they might be inheriting if we don't take action now.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, I too hope to be a grandparent at some point, though I do tell my daughters not too soon. But I'll have to say, both my daughters question whether they want to have children, actually, because of their fears around what the world's going to look like. And that really, in some ways, it breaks my heart. And in other ways, it motivates me to do the work that I do, and gives me the energy to keep going. Some days when you feel like, oh, are we really making progress? And so I think it's a really important question. I appreciate the person who asked it. Sonia, we need to wrap up shortly, and I wanted to just get your impressions on, your thoughts on COP26, what came out of the negotiations from Glasgow, kind of how you would interpret it, how you've been talking about it as your role as the leader of the BC Greens.
It's interesting. When I was 17, I went to a model UN sort of forum in Rocky Mountain House in Alberta, and spent the better part of a week there. And it was a very important time for my mind to think about the world writ large. I was the UK at the UN, and one of the groups that was there, their motto was think globally and act locally. And I feel like that has been very much a central part of my thinking ever since, really. And the COP26 outcomes were, in some ways quite disappointing. The resistance to recognizing we can't continue to not only build new fossil fuel infrastructure, we can't subsidize fossil fuel infrastructure. We can't subsidize the industry. It makes no sense. And I think about here in British Columbia, the significant subsidies that have gone into the LNG Canada project, and literally billions in subsidies. And the fact that we're turning around at the same time and looking at billions in rebuilding costs for roads and infrastructure and towns. And it literally, it's hard to really understand how we fuel that fire with public money, and the costs writ large to all of us, to our health, to our well-being, and to our infrastructure. So I think I come back out of that, and I think, here I am in British Columbia. I'm a representative in this province, and I put a lot of my efforts and thoughts into how do we become the leaders that we need the rest of the world to be. And we're a ways off from that, and especially when it comes to subsidizing oil and gas. I think that Quebec has shown leadership that I'm proud of, and I think we should be recognizing that in our country as what we need to be seeing in all the provinces. And I think the other thing is we can't let discouragement overtake us at any point. These are tough times. Like, it is, I saw a tweet yesterday, and it said, British Columbia, the land of Jumanji, which is sort of how it feels right now. Like, what herd of elephants is coming through my door next? Because that's how this year has been. But that what we owe our grandchildren, our future generations, is that relentless commitment to, I am going to do what it takes here. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to focus on solutions. I'm going to have a vision for a future where our communities are resilient and people's needs are met and our natural systems are healthy and our institutions and governments are trustworthy. We can get there. And that's what I put my energy into, is where do we need to get to? What will it feel like when we get there? It's so much more connection and safety and resilience. And how do we measure our success? And that's the approach that I'm taking. And as a two-person caucus here in BC, just like you, Mike, one green, two greens, three greens are very significant in our legislatures, because we bring in this lens of future-orientated, truth-telling, climate justice that is so desperately needed right now.
Wow, well, very powerful. And I almost was going to say, do you want to wrap up? But I don't know if you can top what you just said as a wrap up, but I wanted to give you an opportunity, Sonia, if there's any just final parting words from British Columbia to Ontarians about what the
Mhm,
people in the province are experiencing, what you need from the rest of the country
mhm.
to help you get through this really challenging and difficult time.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of struggling and grief happening right here. The Red Cross, the provincial and the federal government are matching donations for Red Cross flood relief here in BC. And if you go to our BC Greens website, we have that link up. We also have links to local community organizations and groups that are helping in specific communities that are hit the hardest, particularly, for example, Abbotsford, Merit, Hope right now. Um, and so there's ways of contributing in that way. But I would say the other thing to do is you know, be informed, understand what's happening, and then recognize that we all have to lean in right now, and we all have to decide on that future that we want. And you know, it's much more than a partisan plug that I say support Mike, support the Greens in Ontario. But we need the kind of leadership that Mike, that you have brought, and I'm so honored to call you my colleague across the country here. But you know, I really encourage people, get involved with the Greens, get involved in your community, be that change that we all need to see. And the motto that I have for our work here and our party is rooted in purpose and joy. And I find that those two things tend to feed each other. But having a sense of purpose, clear purpose, and remembering that in all of this struggle and challenge that we're facing, to see the places of joy, people helping each other, people stepping up, people volunteering, people showing up. It is extraordinary what we're capable of as human beings. And let's tap into that emergency place that we go to that is so good and so strong, and let's carry that past the emergency and start to shape the future with it.
Well, Sonia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you're incredibly busy and it's a very challenging time in British Columbia. So for you to give us, 45 minutes of your time is very precious. And I just want to express my gratitude, and also just to say what an honor it is to call you a colleague and a friend. And I look forward to getting through these pandemic times so I can join you and knock on doors again together, and just spend some time with you and your community and with the BC Green. So thank you so much. And I just want to encourage folks, if you have an opportunity to visit the BC Greens website, and if you can make a contribution in that way, I'm sure we make a huge difference in the lives of people and communities that are really in need right now.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Be safe, be well.